Gaza appears again and again at the center of conflict, raising questions that go beyond politics and headlines. Why does this small strip of land keep erupting in violence, even when wars end elsewhere? What role does Gaza play that makes it impossible to silence or stabilize? And more importantly, does the Bible say anything specific about Gaza itself? Or is it merely a modern problem projected backward into Scripture? When the Bible mentions Gaza, it does not do so casually. It places this city at key moments of resistance, judgment, and unresolved tension, long before modern nations existed. To understand Gaza today, we must ask what Scripture already revealed about it. If you're still watching, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe, and stay with us as we follow this pattern step by step. Long before the name Palestine was ever spoken by an empire, Gaza already existed as a border city, a place where pressure gathered and conflict returned generation after generation. In the Bible, Gaza does not first appear as a political symbol, but as part of a coastal stronghold controlled by a people known as the Philistines, a group who arrived in the land not by covenant, but by migration and conquest. They were not native to Canaan in the way Israel traced its claim through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but came from across the sea, settling along the Mediterranean coast and forming a powerful alliance of 5 cities, with Gaza standing as one of its most strategic centers. Archaeology confirms what Scripture implies. The Philistines brought with them a distinct culture, foreign pottery styles, and advanced iron technology that gave them a military advantage over the tribes of Israel during the period of the Judges. Their presence in Gaza was not accidental. The city controlled trade routes, coastal access, and military movement, making it a natural base for domination rather than coexistence. This is why, in the biblical narrative, Gaza repeatedly appears not as a neutral location, but as a place from which pressure against Israel radiated outward. The conflict between Israel and the Philistines was never framed in Scripture as a simple clash of religions. It was a struggle over land, authority, and destiny. Israel understood itself as a people called into the land by divine promise, while the Philistines functioned as occupiers who relied on strength, numbers, and technology. Gaza became a stage where this contrast was repeatedly acted out. Samson's story, often remembered for its drama, is deeply tied to Gaza, ending with the strong man blinded, bound, and displayed there, turning the city into a symbol of mockery against Israel's God, even as judgment loomed beneath the surface. Over time, the Philistines disappeared from history as a people, absorbed or erased by successive empires, yet Gaza remained. This reversal is striking. The people vanished, but the place endured. Israel, by contrast, would later lose its land, yet retain its identity. Scripture leaves this pattern intentionally unresolved, allowing Gaza to stand as a reminder that land can outlive nations, and names can persist even when their original meaning is forgotten. From its earliest appearance, Gaza was not merely a city on the coast, but a threshold where resistance to God's unfolding plan gathered, paused, and returned again. The transformation of Judea into what the world would later call Palestine did not happen gradually, nor did it emerge from the people who lived on the land. It was imposed deliberately, in the aftermath of one of the most devastating revolts in Jewish history. Between 132 and 135, the Jewish population of Judea rose against Roman rule in what became known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, a final attempt to resist imperial control after decades of oppression. For a brief moment, the rebellion appeared successful, restoring hope that Jewish sovereignty might yet survive. Rome responded with overwhelming force. Ancient Roman historians provide an unflinching record of what followed. Cassius Dio describes a scorched land, hundreds of towns and villages destroyed, and immense loss of life, estimating that hundreds of thousands of Jews perished. Modern historians caution that such numbers may be exaggerated. Yet archaeology confirms widespread destruction across Judea during this period, with burn layers, abandoned settlements, and revolt coinage bearing witness to the scale of the catastrophe. This was not merely a military defeat. It was a civilizational rupture. Emperor Hadrian's response went far beyond crushing resistance. He sought to erase identity itself. Jewish religious practices, including circumcision, were outlawed. Jerusalem was refounded as a Roman colony, renamed Aelia Capitolina, and a temple to Jupiter was erected on the site of the destroyed Jewish temple. Jews were barred from entering the city on pain of death, permitted only once a year to mourn its ruins. Yet the most enduring act was linguistic rather than architectural. Hadrian ordered Judea to be renamed Syria Palestina. The choice was calculated. The name was drawn from Philistia, recalling Israel's ancient enemies, the Philistines, a people long vanished by Hadrian's time. By reviving their name and attaching it to the land of Judah, Rome branded Jewish memory with humiliation. This was not a neutral administrative label, but a symbolic punishment. The land promised to the descendants of Judah was now marked with the name of those who once opposed them. From that moment on, Judea vanished from imperial maps. Palestine appeared instead, not as a reflection of demographic reality, but as an act of domination. The strategy worked politically. Over centuries, the name spread through official documents, Christian writings, and later Islamic administration, becoming familiar to the world while its origin faded from memory. Scripture, however, preserves what empires attempt to overwrite. While Rome succeeded in renaming the land, it did not succeed in ending the covenantal narrative tied to it. The name Palestine would endure, but as a reminder not of continuity, rather of how power seeks to rewrite destiny through words, and how history remembers the attempt, even when it forgets the intention behind it. The scattering of the Jewish people after the fall of Judea did not come as a surprise within Scripture, even though its scale and duration would stretch far beyond what any generation could imagine. Long before Rome marched through Jerusalem, the Torah itself warned that the land was conditional, not because the promise was weak, but because the covenant was moral. Moses spoke plainly that disobedience would lead to removal, that the people would be uprooted and scattered among the nations, serving foreign powers in lands not their own. Exile, in the biblical frame, was not an accident of history, but a consequence already spoken. The prophets returned to this theme relentlessly. Jeremiah described a people driven beyond familiar borders, pursued even in foreign lands by sword and famine. Hosea spoke of wandering, not as travelers, but as those without rest. Ezekiel framed the dispersion as a breaking apart, a nation reduced to fragments, alive yet functionally dead. What makes the exile unique, however, is not that Israel was scattered, but that it was never dissolved. Other peoples disappeared into the empires that conquered them, absorbed linguistically, religiously, and culturally. Israel did not. Across centuries and continents, without land, temple, or sovereignty, Jewish identity endured. Law replaced geography. Scripture replaced borders. Prayer replaced sacrifice. Even as Jews lived under Roman, Persian, Islamic, and Christian rule, their collective memory remained oriented toward Jerusalem. This persistence was not political strength, but theological tension. The Bible presents exile not as replacement, but as suspension, a long pause in which judgment operates without canceling promise. Crucially, the prophets never described exile as permanent. Alongside warnings came assurances that scattering would one day be reversed. The same God who dispersed would gather. The same hand that uprooted would replant. The covenant with Abraham was not revoked, only delayed in its visible fulfillment. This is why the Bible speaks of exile and return in the same breath, refusing to let loss have the final word. For nearly 2,000 years, this tension remained unresolved. The people were everywhere, yet nowhere at home. The land carried new names, new rulers, new religions. Yet the biblical narrative insisted that dispersion was a chapter, not the ending. History moved on, but Scripture waited. If you're still watching, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe, and continue with us as the story moves from scattering toward restoration. Among all the prophetic visions in Scripture, few are as vivid or as misunderstood as Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. It appears at a moment when exile had drained Israel of every visible sign of life. The people were scattered, the land lay under foreign control, and hope itself seemed unreasonable. Into this setting, Ezekiel was carried in the spirit to a valley filled not with bodies, but with bones, bleached, scattered, and lifeless. A scene meant to remove all ambiguity. This was not weakness. This was death. The meaning of the vision is not left to interpretation. God Himself explains it. These bones are the whole house of Israel. They represent a people who say, "Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost." This is not a metaphor for individual faith or spiritual renewal. It is a national diagnosis. Israel is described as finished, erased, cut off from history. The condition of the bones emphasizes impossibility. Nothing remains from which life could logically return. What follows is deliberate and ordered. The bones come together before they live. Structure precedes breath. Sinews and flesh appear, yet the bodies remain lifeless until the spirit enters them. The sequence matters. Scripture presents restoration as a process, not an instant reversal. First comes regathering, then form. Only afterward does breath enter. This pattern challenges expectations. God does not promise immediate spiritual renewal, but a physical and national restoration that prepares the ground for something deeper. The vision then reaches its clearest declaration. God promises to open graves and bring His people back into the land of Israel. These graves are not literal tombs, but the nations where Israel was buried as a people, scattered across empires and continents. The return described is geographical and collective. It is a return to land, not merely to belief. God ties this act directly to His identity, saying that when it happens, Israel will know that He is the Lord. The final stage of the vision points beyond return. God declares that He will put His Spirit within them and settle them on their land. Restoration is not presented as the end, but as preparation. The vision does not deny future struggle, conflict, or incompleteness. It does, however, establish something unmovable. Israel's reappearance in history would not be coincidence, nor political accident, but fulfillment spoken in advance. For centuries, this prophecy stood unresolved, suspended between promise and impossibility. Yet Scripture insists that what looks dead to history is not dead to God, and that nations, like bones, can rise again when the moment appointed arrives. As centuries passed after the exile, the land once called Judea did not remain empty, silent, or abandoned. Under successive empires, first Islamic, then Ottoman, the region continued to be lived in, farmed, taxed, and governed. Arab communities developed deep roots, with families cultivating the same land for generations, building towns, villages, and religious life that reflected continuity rather than interruption. By the time the Ottoman Empire firmly controlled Palestine in the 16th century, the land had become home to a predominantly Arab population, Muslim and Christian, living alongside small but persistent Jewish communities, concentrated mainly in cities like Jerusalem, Safed, Tiberias, and Hebron. For nearly 400 years, Ottoman rule kept the region relatively stable, though often neglected. Palestine was not a nation-state, but a province within a vast empire, its identity shaped more by local life than by centralized power. This continuity matters, because it challenges the assumption that the land was merely waiting, frozen in time, for a future return. From a historical perspective, Palestine was inhabited, worked, and remembered by those who lived there, even as biblical memory preserved a different layer of meaning, tied to covenant rather than administration. The late 19th century introduced a new movement into this long-settled landscape. Zionism emerged in Europe as a response to relentless Jewish persecution, pogroms, and exclusion. It was both a political project and a survival strategy, seeking a homeland where Jews could exist without dependence on the goodwill of others. When Jewish immigrants began arriving in Palestine, they entered a land already occupied, not an empty stage, creating a collision between historical continuity and prophetic expectation. World War I shattered the old order. The defeat of the Ottoman Empire brought Palestine under British control, transforming the region into a geopolitical question rather than a provincial afterthought. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 expressed British support for a Jewish national home, while simultaneously promising not to prejudice the rights of existing non-Jewish communities. This dual commitment contained an unresolved contradiction that would only grow sharper with time. During the British Mandate, Jewish immigration increased dramatically, especially as anti-Semitism in Europe intensified and ultimately culminated in the Holocaust. The arrival of survivors seeking refuge changed the demographic and emotional landscape, while Arab resistance hardened in response to fears of displacement. By 1947, Palestine had become a land claimed by two peoples, each with history, suffering, and legitimacy, yet bound to incompatible futures. The United Nations Partition Plan attempted to impose resolution through borders, but war followed instead. When Israel declared statehood in 1948, the fulfillment of Jewish return unfolded alongside the catastrophe Palestinians would later call the Nakba, as hundreds of thousands fled or were expelled. Scripture does not deny the human cost of this moment, yet it frames history as moving forward under tension rather than closure. If you're still watching, stay with us, because the story does not settle here, and what follows only deepens the pattern already in motion. The story of Gaza enters a new phase in the early 21st century, when Israel made the unexpected decision to withdraw completely from the territory. In 2005, all Israeli settlements were dismantled, military installations removed, and thousands of Jewish residents were forcibly relocated. The move was framed as a step toward reducing conflict and opening a path to peace, an attempt to separate and de-escalate after decades of friction. For the first time in years, Gaza stood without an Israeli civilian or military presence inside its borders. What followed did not bring stability. The absence of direct control created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by militant leadership rather than civil reconstruction. Internal Palestinian divisions erupted into open conflict, and Gaza came under the control of Hamas, an organization defined by armed resistance rather than negotiation. Instead of becoming a model of self-governance, the territory hardened into a fortified enclave, its resources directed toward confrontation rather than development. From that point forward, Gaza entered a repeating cycle. Rocket fire, airstrikes, ceasefires, and breakdowns followed one another with grim regularity. Each round left deeper scars, particularly among civilians, while political solutions grew more distant. Gaza's borders tightened, movement became restricted, and daily life increasingly revolved around survival rather than future planning. International attention surged during moments of crisis, only to fade when the fighting paused, leaving the underlying conditions unchanged. From a biblical perspective, this pattern is striking not because it is new, but because it feels familiar. Gaza once again functions as a pressure point, a place where conflict concentrates without resolution. Scripture does not offer a timeline for peace here, nor does it present Gaza as a site of final answers. Instead, it appears as a location where human attempts to impose closure repeatedly fail. The land remains contested. The population remains trapped between forces larger than itself. And each escalation reinforces the sense that political mechanisms alone are insufficient. Gaza becomes less a solution to the conflict and more a symbol of its endurance. History advances, technologies change, and actors rotate. Yet the fundamental tension persists, as if the land itself resists being settled by agreements that do not address deeper roots. In this way, Gaza mirrors its earliest role in Scripture, standing not as a conclusion, but as an unresolved threshold, where conflict returns, pauses, and returns again, awaiting a resolution that history has not yet provided. After describing Israel's return from exile and restoration to the land, the book of Ezekiel moves immediately into a vision that shifts the focus from recovery to confrontation. Chapters 38 and 39 introduce Gog of the land of Magog, a figure who emerges not during Israel's weakness, but after its regathering. This placement is deliberate. The threat appears when Israel is back in the land, dwelling again as a people, suggesting that restoration does not end conflict, but instead sets the stage for its final exposure. The language of this prophecy belongs to the apocalyptic tradition, rich with imagery, symbols, and layered meaning. Because of this, it has been interpreted in different ways across Jewish and Christian history. Some readers understand Gog and Magog symbolically, as a representation of the final uprising of evil against God's purposes, rather than a literal military campaign. Others, particularly within a literal futurist framework, read the text as describing a real coalition of nations that will rise against Israel in the latter days. Scripture itself allows this tension to remain, offering description without fixing a timetable. What remains consistent across interpretations is the direction of the narrative. Gog does not rise independently. God declares that He Himself will draw this force into the land, placing hooks in its jaws. The invasion is not presented as a surprise attack that catches God off guard, but as an event permitted, even orchestrated, to serve a larger purpose. The focus of the prophecy is not on the strength of the invading armies, but on what their defeat will reveal. Ezekiel describes an overwhelming assault, a force moving like a storm cloud over the land. Yet Israel is not portrayed as defending itself through superior strategy or power. Instead, judgment comes directly from God. Earthquakes shake the land. Confusion turns the invaders against one another. and natural forces complete what human resistance does not begin. The victory is absolute, and it is unmistakably divine. The text emphasizes this point repeatedly, declaring that the nations will know that the Lord is God. This outcome reveals the heart of the prophecy. Gog and Magog are not primarily about geopolitical prediction, but about vindication. God's name, once profaned among the nations during Israel's exile, is now revealed as holy. The restoration of Israel is shown to be permanent, not because Israel becomes flawless, but because God declares that he will no longer hide his face from his people. In this light, the prophecy functions as a theological conclusion rather than a military forecast. It does not invite speculation about dates or alliances, but points toward an end in which human power reaches its limit. Conflict is not resolved through negotiation or dominance, but through disclosure, when history is forced to acknowledge that control never truly belonged to empires, coalitions, or weapons, but to God alone. As the biblical narrative reaches its final horizon, Gaza does not appear as a conclusion to be resolved, but as a sign that continues to speak. From its earliest mention in Scripture to its role in modern conflict, Gaza functions less as a destination and more as a threshold, a place where resistance gathers and where human attempts at control repeatedly fall short. The Bible never frames Gaza as the center of God's promises, yet it consistently places it near moments of confrontation, as though its purpose is to reveal tension rather than to provide rest. This pattern invites a broader perspective. Empires have ruled Gaza, renamed it, fortified it, and fought over it. Yet none have been able to settle it permanently. Philistines vanished. Romans renamed the land. Caliphates rose and fell. Modern states withdrew and returned. Through all of this, Gaza remained, absorbing conflict without resolving it. Scripture treats this persistence not as coincidence, but as part of a larger story in which land itself becomes a witness to human limits. At the heart of the biblical vision is a clear distinction between what belongs to God and what is claimed by nations. The land, according to Scripture, is not ultimately owned by those who occupy it or divide it, but by the one who declared, "The land is mine." This assertion does not erase human suffering or invalidate competing histories. Instead, it reframes them. Political authority operates within time. Covenant operates across it. When these two collide, tension is inevitable. Jerusalem stands at the center of this collision, described by the prophets as a burden too heavy for the nations to bear. Gaza, by contrast, sits at the edge, where pressure accumulates and spills outward. Together, they form a geographic and symbolic frame through which Scripture invites readers to see beyond headlines. The Bible does not call its audience to choose sides, but to recognize patterns, to notice how often power fails when it attempts to rewrite what was spoken long before. Importantly, the biblical vision does not end with triumphalism. Israel's restoration does not erase conflict, nor does it guarantee peace through human strength. Instead, it points toward a future moment when God Himself intervenes, not to reward violence, but to bring clarity. The wars of history expose human ambition. The intervention of God exposes truth. Until that moment, history remains unfinished, and places like Gaza continue to bear the weight of unresolved questions. In this sense, Gaza is not a verdict against any one people, but a sign that the story is still moving. It reminds us that agreements can pause conflict without ending it, that borders can shift without healing wounds, and that history alone cannot close what Scripture has opened. The Bible does not ask readers to predict outcomes, but to watch carefully, to remain aware that events unfolding in the present are connected to words spoken in the past. If this perspective has helped you see Gaza, Palestine, and Scripture with greater clarity, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you can continue exploring these themes with us. Thank you for watching, and for staying with the story as it continues to unfold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a quiet moment behind the lens. Piecing together this narrative means digging through layers of history, from the Iron Age strongholds of the Philistines to the deliberate Roman remaining of Judea as Palestine. We focus on tracing these historical footprints to understand why this strip of land remains a persistent pressure point across generations. Personally, I find it striking that while empires vanish, the land itself acts as a witness to human limits, resisting every attempt at a purely political settlement. Gaza stands as a threshold, reminding us that history is still moving toward a resolution that hasn't yet been reached. If you value exploring these timeless patterns over simple headlines, please subscribe. Let's keep searching for the truth together here at the Power of the Jesus.